Good evening, everyone. I think people are filtering in from the waiting room. Welcome to our European Dyslexia Association webinar this evening for Dyslexia Awareness Month, which is October, as I'm sure you all know. We're delighted to have with us this evening Professor Julia Carroll from the University of Birmingham. And Professor Carroll has been a leading researcher in literacy and dyslexia for many years. And in particular was one of the lead authors on the Delphi study, which is why we're gathered here this evening to hear her share the process, I suppose, the journey that was involved in that study and the new definition of dyslexia, which I think is really very welcome to have that new consensus definition. So I'm going to hand over now to Professor Carroll, and we look forward to your presentation. Just to say for everyone, we are recording the webinar, so we will be sharing the recording afterwards. And if anyone has any questions throughout, if you can use the Q&A function, there's a little Q&A button there on the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to pop your question into the Q&A, then we'll try and if we have time for some of those, we'll put those to Julia at the end, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Feel free, obviously, as someone has already started, but if you'd like to pop your name or even say where you're joining us from into the chat, then please do as we go along as well. So otherwise, over to you, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. We had a little bit of to and fro about this in the practice, so hopefully it will go smoothly. So
that's looking perfect.
Excellent. Good. Okay. So thank you very much, Rosie. And thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking about, as Rosie said, the Dyslexia Delphi study that I've been working on for the past couple of years. I'm going to start off with a little bit of background about why we felt that consensus definition was needed, and then a bit of explanation about what a Delphi study is and why we decided to use a Delphi study. Then I'm going to talk about what the consensus was and a little bit about what I think the implications are for diagnosis, policy, assessment, and so on. So in terms of why we need consensus around a definition, well, I guess one question is whether we need a diagnosis of dyslexia at all. And this is a quote from Edmund Sonuga-Buck around models of childhood disorder, arguing that at some level, clinicians, people working with individuals with difficulties, are categorized as trying to get the right treatment to the right people. So I'd argue the main reason that you want a consensus definition is to try and get the right treatment to the right people. And I'd also argue that's not necessarily happening at the moment. So certainly in the UK, we have had discussion and debate over the past year about how dyslexia support and diagnosis is progressing and what kind of state it's in the UK. And we've had headlines like this, headlines from the Times in June, suggesting that the kids are being failed in terms of dyslexia support and diagnosis. That's not just in the popular media. So I had a paper with my PhD student, Angela Thompson, looking at parents' experiences of their dyslexic child's journey through school. And this also suggested that there were difficulties in diagnosis and support. So, for example, we had a parent say, there appears to be no money, no specialist knowledge, not even a basic knowledge. I had one teacher say, I've been teaching for 15 years and I've never come across a dyslexic. another parent saying, I've almost written off her primary school years. From speaking to other parents, everyone says you see a massive change when you go to secondary school. You just do not get the support in primary school. You've just got to get through it and hope things change when you get to secondary. I think most kind of crucially for my argument or my concerns is this statement. They said he doesn't need to be assessed. We've put in everything in place as if he was dyslexic. So this is quite commonly said in the UK, that we don't need an assessment. We can put things in place and treat an individual as if they're dyslexic, and the assessment is a kind of optional extra. And that's not just parent perception. That is something that some education councils in England have been arguing for. So particularly Warwickshire and Staffordshire have argued that we don't need to have diagnosis for dyslexia. They've called this disorder scientifically questionable and suggested instead that we should be focusing on early reading support for all. What's happened in many cases in these counties where the state system doesn't support dyslexia diagnosis is that parents respond by seeking private assessment and battling for individuals additional support, which of course means that there's an income divide, that it's those parents who can afford to get private assessment. I'm really sorry, I'm just going to have to deal with my pets for a moment. Yeah. Really sorry about that. I have a puppy and she was starting a fight with my cat. Okay, so in 2020, I was asked to carry out a review for the Office for Science and Technology, looking at current understanding and support systems for specific learning difficulties in the UK. Some of the things that I highlighted was that there's a lack of consistency over time. So there's different expectations or requirements for diagnosis in school or college or university or work. There's differences between the criteria that are used in research and practice. It's not very clear what the roles of specialist teachers and educational psychologists are. So in England, both specialist teachers and educational psychologists can diagnose dyslexia. And so it can be difficult for parents and even schools to know when they should call in a specialist teacher versus call in an educational psychologist. So this all feeds into quite a confusing situation for parents and teachers, and most importantly for individuals with dyslexia. So this is some of the background about why we felt that it was useful to get a consensus definition. Some of the other background is, you might remember that I said that some local authorities in England had called dyslexia scientifically questionable. That seems to have come from, at least in part, from some work by Joe Elliott, arguing that there are problems in how dyslexia is diagnosed. So in a 2020 paper, for example, he highlights 4 different approaches to defining dyslexia. He says that sometimes the word dyslexia is used to mean all individuals with poor reading accuracy. Sometimes it's used to mean individuals, a subgroup of some of those individuals with poor reading accuracy, which is decided clinically and would require assessment. The third option is that dyslexia is defined in terms of individuals whose reading difficulties don't respond well to intervention. And then the final one is more complex, looking at a neurodiverse profile which goes beyond reading difficulties and in some cases may not include reading difficulties. Elliott argues that all of these approaches are problematic, and the fact that these different approaches are going on at the same time means that it is problematic to say exactly what dyslexia is and to give a clear definition for it. So we felt it was crucial to have a clear definition for dyslexia. We have, of course, there were in existence definitions of dyslexia. So the two most commonly used definitions were in the UK are from the Rose Report, which was published in 2019. This is the definition in the Rose Report. Dyslexia is a learning difficulty that primarily affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. Characteristic features are difficulties in phonological awareness, verbal memory, and verbal processing speed. Dyslexia occurs across the range of intellectual abilities. It is best thought of as a continuum, not a distinct category, and there are no clear cut-off points. A good indication of the severity and persistence of dyslexic difficulties can be gained by examining how the individual responds or has responded to well-founded intervention. So that links to Elliott's definition number 3. And co-occurring difficulties may be seen in aspects of language, motor coordination, mental calculation, concentration, and personal organisation, but these are not by themselves markers of dyslexia. So this is possibly the most widely used definition of dyslexia used in the English school system. Another really widely used definition comes from the International Dyslexia Association. This is dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. Difficulties can typically result from a deficit to the phonological component of language that's often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So those are quite long definitions, to have a bit of a comparison between the two of them. Both of those definitions mention word reading accuracy and fluency. The Rose definition mentions co-occurring disorders. The IDA definition doesn't mention co-occurring disorders, but it does mention some potential consequences, such as difficulties in reading comprehension. Both of the definitions mention phonological skills. And they both have some indication of possible causes. So Rose's definition mentions that it's worthwhile to look at how an individual responds to intervention. The IDA definition is more firm, directive in saying that dyslexia is neurobiological in origin. So they don't allow for a kind of environmental effect of dyslexia. And then they differ in terms of how they talk about the role of intellectual abilities. So the Rose definition says that dyslexia can occur across the range of IQ. So it really suggests that IQ doesn't have a significant role in defining dyslexia. Whereas the IDA definition says that dyslexia is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. So neither of these definitions uses a classical strict discrepancy definition, looking for a difference between IQ and literacy difficulties. But the IDA definition does suggest that the literacy difficulties are unexpected in comparison to other cognitive abilities, the Rose definition doesn't make that comparison at all. Okay, so we have different factors going on in the school system. We have, according to Elliott, different definitions in use. And if we look at some of the most commonly used definitions, there are some key differences between them, particularly around intellectual abilities and possible causes. So we felt that it was useful to try and build up consensus to try and get a shared definition that everyone would be, hopefully would be happy with. And one way to do that is to use a Delphi study. So a Delphi study is a method used to try and gain a consensus between a group of experts on a particular topic. So the idea is that you assemble a group of experts and you have an initial set of statements of statements around a particular topic, and you ask people to rate them, say whether they agree with them or disagree with them, and also to make comments and say what they their view is and why they've given that particular rating. A key feature is that everyone's doing this anonymously, but everyone can see everyone else's responses. So after you have given in your feelings about different statements, you can see what other people's responses to those statements were, but you don't know who has made those responses. Then we can work on those statements and try and look at problematic areas, try and reword them to get statements that people can agree on. And so this is the process that we decided to use to try and get consensus around a definition of dyslexia. So in terms of the demographics of the panel, we've tried to get a wide range of experts. So we've got psychologists from different backgrounds, clinical and educational and occupational psychologists, assessment practitioners, teacher assessors, access arrangements assessors, families and people with dyslexia, and also stakeholding organisations such as British Dyslexia Association, Helen Arkell, Patos, and so on. So you'll see that we have a UK bias. We've tried to get experts within the UK, and most of the individuals who we've contacted come from the UK. So the slight majority from England, but also some from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And then we also have around 14% from of international experts. Again, we've tried to get a good balance of males and females, and we've tried to get a balance of ethnicities, but we have ended up with an 82% white panel. In terms of professions, so 44% of them have given their profession as academics, 9% educational psychologists, 27% as specialist teachers or assessors, and 20% other, which will include those families, stakeholder organisations, and individuals with dyslexia as well. Oh, I don't know where I've gone. So in terms of the process itself, so we came up with 62, it would have been easy if we had 62 candidate statements about dyslexia, and we've taken these from the SASC review. So the SASC is a committee giving guidance about dyslexia assessments, which carried out a review of dyslexia assessment guidance in 2023. So that review was very detailed. We used that to pull out a lot of candidate statements from that review, but also from relevant books. So The Science of Reading by Maggie Snowling, and The Dyslexia Debate by Elliott and Grigorenko. We had the moderating group, which was myself, Maggie Snowling, Caroline Holden from SASC, and Philip Kirby, who works on the history of dyslexia. And we cut down those 62 candidate statements to 55 round one statements. We asked the expert panel, about 58 experts, to rate the statements and review them. We sent the feedback to the panel, and we tried to decide whether or not the statements were accepted or viewed positively by 80% of the panel. If so, they were accepted. If not, they were reworded. And we sent out 22 statements for round two, and again got the ratings and statements, and did some rewording again, and came up with our list of agreed statements. So we have 42 agreed statements. The next couple of slides are just kind of overviews of the results. So in round one, the blue here is agree or strongly agree. So we have these 55 statements. Some of them have very high, very blue levels of blue, so they have high agreement. Some of them have much lower levels of agreement. So as I said, we had 27 that had high agreement, 14 that had low agreements, of which 7 were dropped and 7 were significantly reworded. And then we had 14 that were in the middle that we reworded according to the comments that people had made. And round two, we had 22 statements, and 14 of them had agreement above 80%. 4 of them had agreement levels between 75 and 84, which are discussed in a sub-panel, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And 4 of them had agreement below 75, and we decided to drop them. We decided it was not going to be feasible to get agreement on those areas. So you can see we had agreement on a lot of statements. As I said, we had 42. Oh, sorry. This is an example of one of the statements. So this is how it would be presented to the panel. Persistent, sometimes severe difficulties in word and non-word decoding, brackets reading accuracy, are typically observed in children with dyslexia. And they had to say strongly agree, somewhat agree, disagree, and then make additional comments. So this allows us to assess the ratings and select the statements which have consistent agreements, but it also helps us to understand why some statements don't have agreements, because people put those comments on, and that's what allows us to modify them. Okay, so what are the findings? What was our consensus? So as I said, we had a lot of agreement. We had 42 statements that had high levels of agreement, and we've used some of those statements to develop the definition of dyslexia. Some of the areas where we got really good agreement were around the nature of dyslexia. So the idea that dyslexia is primarily a set of processing difficulties that affect aspects of literacy attainment. The statement that I just mentioned, persistence and sometimes severe difficulties in word and non-word decoding are typically observed. Secondary consequences. So this is a statement from the IDA definition, which had good agreement that reading comprehension is a secondary consequence, as is reduced reading experience. And then this co-occurring difficulties, which is a slightly reworded version from the Rose definition, again, had high agreement. So there's high agreement about co-occurring difficulties, secondary consequences, and the nature of dyslexia itself. We had some thorny issues, as you might expect. So some areas where there was less good agreement. So these are the 5 areas where we had less good agreement. One was about setting specific cutoff points. So saying that individuals with dyslexia had to have reading below, say, 1 standard deviation below the average range. And we had quite strong disagreements on this. So some people felt that this really should be included, others felt that it shouldn't be included. And we felt this was really important, so we decided to discuss it further in a face-to-face meeting. Similarly, the role of IQ and intelligence testing. So I highlighted earlier that the 2 widely used definitions have different views on the role of IQ and intelligence testing, and that was also reflected in our responses, that there were different views about this, but we felt this was a really important issue, so again we decided to discuss it further. There were some issues that we didn't get good agreement on, but decided that they were maybe beyond the scope of this panel. So what should be in a screening measure? So if we'd put in everything that people said should be in a screening measure, we'd have quite a full assessment. So there was not good agreement about screening items. I think that maybe reflects the differences of age and different factors. We had disagreements about whether we should think of dyslexia as the extreme of a continuum of reading and spelling skills. So we decided that wasn't crucial to the definition, so we didn't pursue that. And we also had disagreement about whether there was involvement of sensory and motor deficits, and we decided that the research evidence wasn't really strong enough, or that question should really be driven by research evidence, and so we put that to one side. So there are some questions that we obviously haven't been able to answer, but as I said, we felt that cutoff points and IQ were really important to discuss further. So the first issue was around setting specific cutoff points. So we had these statements that had marginal or lower levels of agreement. So in the identification of dyslexia in children, cutoff points of e.g. 1 standard deviation below the mean in 1 or more standardized tests of literacy skills are important for establishing evidence. They provide guidance and prevent over-identification. We only had 65% agreement there. And then a slightly vaguer statement, guidelines are needed so that assessments for dyslexia are consistent. Specific criteria for determining dyslexia are difficult to define, can be expected to vary according to educational context and developmental history. So this had 75% agreement. So there were some people who felt that we really should be having specific cutoff points, some who said that we shouldn't, and often we put in this statement because a lot of the comments about why we shouldn't were about educational context and developmental history. However, we still didn't get agreement, so we have gone for a simpler statement that is doesn't come down strongly on either side, really. Guidelines are needed so that assessments for dyslexia are consistent, but it's difficult to achieve consensus on criteria within these guidelines. So we have said that we think it would be useful to have a criteria, but we haven't been able to achieve consensus on those criteria. The next issue was the role of IQ and intelligence testing. And as I said, this is a really big issue. We had it ranged from people rejecting it completely to people feeling that it had an important place. And some of the comments about negatives about the Rose review were the saying that dyslexia can occur across the range of intellectual abilities, suggests that IQ testing is irrelevant in dyslexia, whereas actually it's potentially quite useful in some cases. So we've decided to accept two statements that were just at the boundaries of agreement level at 79% and 80%. So discrepancy between intellectual ability and literacy attainment is a useful indicator of a specific learning difficulty, but it's not sufficient for a diagnosis in and of itself. So that had 79% agreement, just below our cutoff. And when an individual has generalized learning difficulties, applying a dyslexia label may result in too narrow an approach to intervention, 80% agreement. So these two statements are the statements that we've included around the role of IQ. So we think it's useful to assess IQ, but we don't think that a strict discrepancy definition is the way to go. And then we had another statement which is had lower agreement, and I think is a little bit confusing anyway, so is not being accepted. Dyslexia can be present in an individual regardless of additional problems, but the label should not be used in presence of an intellectual disability or where low levels of attainment can be attributed to lack of exposure to literacy. So we had a higher disagreement with this statement, so we haven't included it. Okay, so those are the thorny issues, but as I said, there was a lot of agreement. So I'll just talk through the agreed statements that we have put into the definition of dyslexia. So we had 42 statements, which is far too many for a definition, and we tried to pick the most central statements that we thought covered the main issues for the definition. So dyslexia is primarily a set of processing difficulties that affect the acquisition of reading and spelling. In dyslexia, some or all aspects of literacy attainment are weak in relation to age, standard teaching and instruction, and level of other attainments. So we haven't specified a cutoff point, but we've suggested that some or all aspects of literacy attainment are weak. Across languages and age groups, difficulties in reading and spelling fluency are a key. Sorry, this is an error. It should say reading fluency and spelling are a key marker of dyslexia. The nature and developmental trajectory of dyslexia depends on multiple genetic and environmental influences. So this is a significant change from the IDA, which talks about a neurobiological cause, with suggesting multiple causes. Dyslexic difficulties exist on a continuum and can be experienced to various degrees of severity. So we've kept the idea of a continuum from the Rose review, but we have not explicitly said that there are no clear cutoff points, because some assessors felt that that was negative and unhelpful. Dyslexia can affect the acquisition of other skills such as mathematics, reading comprehension, or learning another language. The most commonly observed cognitive impairment in dyslexia is a difficulty in phonological processing, i.e. in phonological awareness, phonemic decoding skill, or phonological memory. However, phonological skill difficulties do not fully explain the variability that's observed. And again, that's different from previous definitions, which have focused on phonological skills as the main underlying factor. So we say it's the most common factor, but it's not a full explanation. Working memory, orthographic skills, and processing speed problems can contribute to the impact of dyslexia and therefore should be assessed. Dyslexia frequently co-occurs with one or more other developmental difficulty, including developmental language disorder, dyscalculia, ADHD, and developmental coordination disorder. So that's a lot of words to try and summarize how I think this differs from previous definitions. So I've mentioned some of these as I went through, but I think the four main key issues are a key role for fluency. So we've really tried to highlight how important looking for fluency is. We've also highlighted that dyslexia is about the processing difficulties, not just the attainment itself. So you would normally expect to see difficulties in reading and spelling, but you would also expect to see processing difficulties. We've highlighted that phonological processing is really important, but we've also acknowledged multiple causes and deficits, which I think is a result of some of the research that's come out since the Rose Review. We've also highlighted co-occurring difficulties and secondary consequences, which are highlighted in the Rose definition, but not in other definitions so much. So why did we do these things? Why have we done this? We've focused on fluency because we think that fluency is a key factor in dyslexia that remains an issue regardless of age and language. So we know that adolescents and adults who have dyslexia can sometimes be accurate but slow at reading. So individuals at university with dyslexia, often their major issue is their speed at which they can read and write. And that's also true in transparent orthography. So many European languages, individuals with dyslexia tend to be slow readers but accurate readers. And you may see more difficulties in spelling rather than in reading accuracy. So putting the emphasis on fluency highlights that the definition, or tries to make the definition inclusive across age and language. The second difference is the focus on processing difficulties. So we're trying to move away from purely equating reading and spelling difficulties with dyslexia. There's several reasons for that. Not all individuals who have reading difficulties are dyslexic, and not all individuals with dyslexia have difficulties in all areas of literacy. So we don't want to say that the two things are synonymous. We also don't want to have a definition which runs the risk of people having their diagnosis changing. So if a diagnosis depends on having below average reading and that individual has intervention and no longer has below average reading, they potentially no longer meet criteria for dyslexia, but it's likely, we know from previous research and clinical experience, it's likely that they will continue to have difficulties in other areas, or they may have difficulties as the demands of reading change. So they still have those underlying processing difficulties, which should be central to the diagnosis. And we also focus on persistence of those difficulties over a time, which again fits with trying to avoid the chances of diagnosis changing frequently. However, we have talked about processing difficulties, but not specified exactly what those processing difficulties are, which is potentially quite confusing. But we want to do this because we feel that we don't yet know what all of those processing difficulties are. So we know that phonological processing is important, but we also know that multiple difficulties are important, and we are not yet in a position to be able to name all of those. So we've put less emphasis on a solely neurobiological origin and more on development over time. And we've talked about other factors such as orthographic processing and working memory as contributory factors. So the research evidence about them, those two factors causing dyslexia is not as strong as it is for phonological processing, but the evidence that they are commonly impaired in dyslexia is strong. So we've included them as contributory factors. And then this last point really links up with that previous point, that one of the main changes that we've tried to make is to try and allow space for multiple causes, secondary consequences, and co-occurring difficulties. So we're moving away from thinking of dyslexia as an isolated specific learning difficulty with a single cause, which was kind of the classic view of dyslexia, that it was a disorder in reading and spelling and everything else was absolutely fine, and that any times that it co-occurred with other difficulties was purely coincidental. We now think that that's not a true characterization of dyslexia. Dyslexia is a developmental learning disorder, and developmental disorders tend to have multiple deficits which overlap across multiple disorders. So we know that dyslexia commonly co-occurs with attention and hyperactivity difficulties, and also with language difficulties. And our conceptualization is that that's not just an inconvenience or a coincidence, that is part of the core of the disorder because of the overlapping deficits. So for that reason, co-occurrence should be central in the definition. We need to think about co-occurring difficulties whenever we're thinking about diagnosing dyslexia. Okay, so in terms of thinking about the implications, we have tried to get agreement between psychologists, academics, specialist teachers, and those with lived experience of dyslexia. We feel like this is crucial for further progress and trying to get support. There was good consensus, I haven't mentioned this earlier perhaps, but there was good consensus that for younger children, we should be thinking about intervention rather than diagnosis. So we should be thinking about providing literacy support for younger children, say under about 8. We should not be thinking about diagnosis as the first step, but rather school-based intervention. So diagnosis shouldn't be a barrier to that kind of intervention and support. And that is something that we had good consensus about. That response to that intervention is an important part of looking at diagnosis. So we want to think about diagnosis of dyslexia for individuals who have severe and persistent literacy difficulties. And in those cases, diagnosis can help to provide appropriate ongoing support, and it can also help individuals understand their own profile, help them have an explanation for their difficulties and find other like-minded individuals. Thinking about assessment then, if we're thinking that co-occurring difficulties are a crucial part of the assessment, then we need to have a holistic diagnosis. We need to be thinking about dyslexia in the context of other strengths and weaknesses. And so this quote in red here is from one of the comments on the from one of the expert panel, that the diagnosis has to be holistic. It's not just about intellectual ability and literacy attainment and looking at whether there's a gap. It's trying to look at the overall profile, looking at reading and writing fluency, multiple processing difficulties, and looking at information from multiple times, ideally looking at response to previous intervention, multiple sources, and thinking about awareness, being aware of co-occurring conditions. So the implications for assessment are potentially quite complex. but suggest that a very brief surface assessment is not the way forward that we would suggest. Okay, so summing up, currently dyslexia is defined and diagnosed in different ways by different experts in England. And I know from the discussions that we had with the at the EDA summer seminars that it's defined and diagnosed in different ways in different countries across Europe as well. So we hope that this definition will help to move the field forward because it's based on a consensus between experts. We hope that this can help us come to decisions which will be agreed by the majority of people working in the field. And the new definition highlights that persistent literacy difficulty should form part of the definition alongside evidence of processing difficulties in some form. And I'll finish up there so we have a good amount of time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. That's a great overview of the process. I think it must have been a really interesting process to actually go through in terms of, the statements and refining them. I know myself when I read some of the research, I think it's also really interesting to see what was left out as much as what is left in sometimes is also really interesting. So I would definitely, I popped the links to the two research papers in the chat there. I definitely encourage if anyone is interested to read through the full text at some point. As you say, thank you for leaving some time for questions. If anyone wants to pop a question in the chat box or in the Q&A feature box, then please do. In the meantime, I might, while we wait to see if anyone has any questions, I might throw one or two questions at you. I think the issue of diagnosis not being a barrier to support is I think very important. And I think from a kind of justice point of view, exactly, and ensuring access to that early intervention, not waiting, I think is really, really important. And maybe this is just a word of caution, or how do we how do we make sure that that doesn't lead into systems and government agencies saying, oh, but you don't need a diagnosis, we can support you without it? Because I think that's something we see now in Ireland, where I'm based, that we have moved a lot. We are much more a needs-based allocation in terms of intervention. But unfortunately, a lot of our state agencies now are like, oh, but you don't need an assessment. It's, you won't get anything more with an assessment. But as you pointed out, there's huge value for the individual and the family and others in the understanding that it gives you. So any words of wisdom maybe of how we can manage the two sides of that?
I'm not sure. I think this is a huge issue in the UK as well, that and it's an issue that I run up against. So in our system, you don't need to have a diagnosis in school, and you can get support in the school, which is for a lot of individuals that works fine, and they do get the support in school. And as I said, I think for the younger children, it absolutely should be about support, not diagnosis. But then once you get to work or university, once you get into adulthood, you do need a diagnosis to access support. And so that people are having to navigate this very different system with different rules. And that is something that I would like to try and change, but I'm not sure that I have the answer of how to do it. I think what I am trying to do is say we need to have the support early on, and there are some cases where we need to have the assessment. It doesn't need to be there in every case, but we need to have that option. And here's why and here's when I think we need it, to try and make that clearer. Because yes, I think it's quite easy for governments or local authorities to say, okay, well, if you don't need it at the beginning, then you don't need it, and we'll just not put resources into it. So yeah, it's a real issue, I think.
Yeah. But I think because you at least you address both topics in the definition. So in a way, I suppose it's probably about having that awareness of, yes, there's a point where it's intervention first, but also recognizing the value. And I suppose what we can do is try and make sure that there's equal awareness to both sides of that, so that the pendulum doesn't go too much to, one way or the other. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So question from Annabella in the chat there around, does this definition apply to all languages, English and also more transparent languages?
So we have tried, it is, so the panel were mainly English speakers, but we did have some people working in dyslexia in other languages. We have tried to have a definition that will apply to all languages, which is why we've tried to emphasize the fluency and the multiple processing difficulties, because I think there are some processing difficulties that are more important in other languages. Yeah, so we've tried to make it apply to all languages, but I wouldn't. I would like to have more input from people speaking other languages before we kind of definitely said it does apply.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
The next phase of the research.
Yes.
Yes. Um, a follow-up then from Annabella. The definition highlights the importance of a holistic assessment, and she just notes that this potentially poses a difficulty for systems, maybe both learners and professionals, that require formal diagnosis or identification for the provision of support.
Yes, potentially. I think it does, but I think what we are saying is that that is what's needed. That is what is right for the learner. And if we don't have the skills to provide that, then that's something that we need to change rather than giving assessments that we think are not the kind of the right assessments for the learners. If that makes sense.
It makes sense. So, in other words, perhaps it's the systems. Hopefully, that an updated definition can help to push for change in systems so that they allow for a flexibility and a type of holistic assessment that is more learner centered, I suppose. Yeah. But it takes time to shift systems, I suppose, is the
Yeah.
frustration. Yes. Hmm. Okay, in the chat, sorry, some questions in the Q&A then. So Carmen is asking, in recent EDA seminars, several speakers suggested the need for developing a neurological profile for each child, which identifies the areas in which processing problems occur. This is so that the intervention given is appropriate and effective. Do you think that the new definition supports this idea?
Yes, I think that the profile, and if you read our paper about using the definition for assessment, we do talk about the kind of profile of strengths and weaknesses, and I think that is really important. I think there's still more research needed to try and look at how to match up intervention with profiles of strengths and weaknesses. Um, but I think that is the way that we should be moving forward. Yeah.
Mhm.
Uh,
Okay. Another comment then from Carmen, just in relation to the role of IQ. The second statement made was that where there are generalized learning difficulties, applying a dyslexia label could lead to a narrow approach to intervention. And she's saying, in her experience, the opposite can also occur, where a low IQ is seen as well as dyslexia, no intervention is offered for the dyslexia, that it's all weighted to the more general difficulties. But she does note that she's not in the UK.
Yeah, I think this comes back to the holistic approach to assessment. Absolutely, I've seen that in the UK as well. I've seen children who have been kind of labelled as MLD or GLD, which is a kind of abbreviation for generalized learning difficulties, and then people aren't trying very hard to support them at all. So absolutely, and it is a really difficult issue, which is why we went back and forth about it, because what we want is to have a system where people have the wider profile and try and respond to all of that individual's needs. But it's, yeah, we're maybe quite far away from that, I
Mm.
think.
And I think potentially this is an issue that happens with co-occurrence as well, that sometimes the focus can be overly on one, condition as opposed to another. And in a way,
Yeah.
if you put, let's say, MGLD, dyslexia, ADHD, dyspraxia, I think sometimes whether it's the first one or whether it links with maybe the knowledge base or the environment the person is in, there's often the tendency is to focus on one area rather than seeing the young person as a whole and their whole pattern of strengths and challenges. Um,
Yeah, and I think partly partly that's why I'd like to get away from the kind of classic idea of dyslexia as a single deficit, because I think in some cases that linked up to people saying, okay, well, the reason they're showing ADHD type symptoms is because of the underlying dyslexia, or the reason they're showing literacy difficulties is because of the underlying ADHD. Whereas I think in many cases it's both, and we need to be thinking about both, rather than assuming that if we fix one, it will fix the other, kind of thing. Yeah, but difficult to do, I know. Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
Absolutely, yeah, that's something we would see in my organization a lot, and I think even I think parents often have that, or
Mm.
individuals themselves of maybe they've had a definition of one even many years ago, but they feel it doesn't quite describe what's
Mm.
happening for them, and obviously access to assessment is not always easy and maybe
Yeah.
costly, and people may have to go
Mhm.
privately or there's waiting lists, so it's often
Mm.
a big decision for people, for many reasons to, if they're having to explore more than one potential, assessment, it's tricky. But certainly, yeah, there's a value to having a good, as you say, full holistic understanding of someone's profile. There's a comment here from someone in Greece. Not a question so much, but she just says that in Greece they use the DSM-5 definition, but the evaluation of dyslexia and SPLDs is given after an assessment from several professionals and experts. So, psychologists, teachers, educational psychologists, speech therapists. The evaluation focuses on the individual profile of each student and relevant advice is provided to teachers.
That's great. I
Sounds
think
good.
it is so yeah, I I think that is great. And the DSM-5 definition has I kind of turned away from it early on because it um uh focuses on learning difficulties, and it doesn't maybe use the term dyslexia, but it does talk about specific literacy difficulties. And yeah, so I think it's really how you use that definition, because it has different levels. Um, and then I see that Amalia said most of the work's done in
Ah,
private offices. So um, yeah, I think that the ideal is to try and make sure that kind of assessment is available to everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the challenge sometimes between what's the word? The perceived perfection versus the level of what's good enough, and also means that more we make access to identification available to as many people as possible. And I think there's often that tension between what potential in assessment where you could do all kinds of tests and explore huge amounts of areas for a young person's abilities and processing and attainments. Um, but then if that means that you're only able to assess 10 young people a month, as opposed to if you do a a slightly more pared down version of assessment and you give more people the option to be able to identify it, it's
Mm,
there's always that tension there, I think, with
yeah.
those. um One question I was going to ask you, Julia, is around the issue of difficulty learning other languages, because I think the Delphi definition, I think, is possibly one of the first that very explicitly names that within the definition, that learning other languages are often challenging
Mm.
for individuals with dyslexia. Um, could you maybe just, I suppose, tell us a little bit about how the discussion on that particular statement and why that's included?
Yeah, I think it was quite interesting from my point of view, in that that was a statement that was endorsed by lots of people. So it had high agreement that individuals had difficulties learning other languages. When we were writing it up and formalizing for publication, we were looking at the evidence behind each of these statements, and
Mhm,
actually the research evidence behind that statement was not as strong as I'd imagined. So there is not that much research about dyslexics learning other languages. But what we did find some research, and what research is out there does back up that point. But I think that's maybe why it hasn't been so upfront in definitions before, because there's maybe a bit of a research gap around there. But there's obviously good kind of lived experience, clinical experience,
mhm,
telling us that, and kind of intuitively, that this is a difficulty for individuals with dyslexia. So I think it's an area that we need more research to kind of back up the clinical
yeah,
experience a bit more.
mhm,
Um,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, as you say, it is almost one of those ones that is, as you say, it's almost seems so obvious that if you have challenges with, you know, as you say, reading fluency and spelling in one language, it's highly likely you will have it in
Mm,
in any language, albeit obviously the orthographic depth, etc., is going to potentially play a factor, in terms of
mm,
how significant the impact is, obviously, in English compared to Italian or other things like
yeah.
that. But definitely an area for further further
Yeah.
research.
And I know one of the things that some people mentioned at the summer seminar, the EDA summer seminars, is that sometimes um, they do have experience of people being having less dyslexic difficulties in different languages.
Hmm.
Um, uh, so I think that's something that more research is needed, and I think
Hmm.
it's probably that it's because there's an English bias in the research that's out there, that there's probably also a kind of monolingual bias, because a lot of the most people in the UK and America are only speak English, whereas most people in the rest of the world speak more than one language, and so there's less research about that than there should be, I think.
True. Although, ironically, a lot of them are are having to learn English as a second or third language, which obviously
Yeah.
then, if you come from a more transparent orthography and are then learning a second language, which is one of the most complex languages, it's a pretty it's a tricky ask, I think, certainly. Yeah.
Mm.
Um, just a question there then from Annabella around the issue of accommodations and special arrangements in exams, and the level of severity that obviously requires or necessitates specific arrangements. She's saying such as disregarding spelling, text to speech, extra time. If there are no cutoff points to support the decision, what are the other alternatives?
I think I think this is a really good question that and this is why we really wanted to look at cutoff points carefully, because I think when you make those decisions, um, and I think my personal view is that cutoff points should at least form part of that. I think what we've come down on is that we should be able to see significant difficulties and some evidence of processing difficulties. But I think, yeah, I think when you're looking at, I think we have been talking about diagnosis of the disorder, which is maybe not quite the same as very specific arrangements, as you mentioned here, about spelling mistakes or text to speech. So I think in those cases, maybe it makes much more sense to have cut points to say, okay, if particularly in terms of extra time, if we know that someone is takes twice as long to read the same amount of text as average, then it makes sense for them to have extra time, for example.
Mhm.
Maybe that's a slightly different thing from looking at diagnosis. So, yeah, so I would say that cutoff points are useful in some cases, and maybe it's more in the specific arrangements.
Mhm. Yeah, it is. I think that that's always a tricky one, and I think exam accommodation systems inevitably are very complicated, large processes, and and if those systems therefore then tend to need some kind of regularity to have
Yeah.
consistency, which almost inevitably leads to cutoffs. But as you say, yeah, I would agree with you. I think cutoffs only as a criteria is potentially problematic. You need to, if you can have a more holistic look, even particularly at second level, you schools, I think, have a lot of evidence from young people's performance in terms of, class, in terms of end of term assessments that are done in school and things like that. So there's potentially a lot of, other kind of iterative, let's say, a folio of evidence that you can build up, to
Yeah.
evidence that for young people.
Mm.
Um, I see just a comment there from Carmen, mentioning Judith Cormos and Margaret Smith from the University of Lancaster, who have obviously done lots of work on the issue of teaching foreign languages to students with dyslexia.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's pretty much that's the research that I found.
mhm,
That, yeah, that team. Um, yes, and um, I agree that foreign language learning is not impossible at all. It's just highlighting there's potential difficulties. So, yeah.
mhm. And things like, certainly, obviously, accommodations and exams can be, really
Mm.
really important, if someone is taking a language exam in their education as well. Okay. That's everything in our Q&A. I think I see, just in the chat there, Paola asking about a new definition of dyslexia from EDA. We will in EDA probably be looking at updating our own definition wording how we describe dyslexia, not to the level of doing a Delphi study, but I think there's some amazing pieces of work being done at the moment. Obviously, the Delphi study that Julia and her colleagues have done in the UK. I know the International Dyslexia Association, and in America, they're at the end of a piece over there looking at definition as well. So I think yes, it is something that we'll be looking at in EDA, probably more just a linguistic description of how we do it, but one that is aligned with the up-to-date research base as well. Um, Someone was just asking about the language research in Lancaster. So it's Judith Cormos is her name. Ah, thank you, Julia.
Yeah.
You type faster than I did. Yeah.
It's because you're
Um,
you're talking at the same time, so it's
yeah,
yeah.
there you go.
Fine.
So yeah, no, very good, good guidance. All right, absolutely. And actually, I think she has an online course for teachers of foreign languages as well, which is really useful in terms of strategies for other languages also. So listen, I think we will leave it there. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight and for taking part and for the questions. And thank you, obviously, most importantly, to Julia for very kindly giving us your time for Dyslexia Month to do this webinar and to just help to disseminate the results of the great piece of research that you did with the Delphi study. And obviously, we look forward to seeing, what developments there are over time with it, perhaps in, looking at maybe bringing in others with other languages or, some of those trickier areas, hopefully over time, as there is more research evidence base coming in specific areas, that it can bring greater confidence on some of those other statements as well. So yes, thank you everyone. We'll send an email out in a couple of days with a copy of the link to the recording as well to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.